there, folks. It's Zach at Feel Free to Argue, and I've been catching up a little bit on my Democracy Now! Viewing, and there are a couple of interesting things that I saw that I wanted to keep you all appraised of. The first thing was, and this was yesterday's show, she had a couple of attorneys on, Scott Horton and Michael Ratner, discussing the changes in our torture policies. And one of them, who writes for Harper's Magazine, took more of a wait-and-see attitude, said Obama has shown some, sincere displeasure with the previous administration's policies, and let's see how far he goes in terms of changing everything. We can't expect him to change everything right away. He's done some good faith initiatives so far, and basically advocating more of a wait and see approach. And the other guy was more of an absolutist, and that's Michael Ratner, and he works for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And he takes more of the approach that I do, that you should assume that anything that is not specifically banned is eventually going to be used. And he said there's a lot of loopholes where things are just very poorly defined, and you should assume that these things are going to be exploited. Like when it says that the CIA can hold people for a limited amount of time. Well, he says, what's a limited amount of time? Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it several months? Is it 7 years, like the people in Guantanamo? And you need to have serious definitions for stuff like that if you're going to allow it at all. And I think he also made a really good case for not allowing any kind of rendition, because everybody's applauding the fact that Obama's going to try to stop extraordinary rendition, which is basically a rendition where there's torture at the end of it. But he says that this whole idea of grabbing people off the streets of other countries and violating the sovereignty of other countries is just generally, a bad idea, and endorses international lawlessness. And that's basically the way that I feel about it. I mean, I don't think my country has any right to go in and forcibly violate the laws of another country and rip somebody off the streets there. Whatever the acclaimed purpose of that is. So, and he even makes an argument. Amy Goodman at some point asked him, so well, this is the way that we got Eichmann, and he says, even extreme an example of Eichmann, you've got to remember that this is something that's being used by powerful countries against weak countries. And then he made the whole example of U.S. and Cuba. If Cuba came in here and grabbed somebody off the streets in the United States, I mean, that would probably be the end of Cuba. We would feel fully justified in using the full military force of the United States to go in there and basically, wipe Cuba off the map. But if by the same token, U.S. operatives went into Cuba and did the exact same thing, there would be uproar, there would be anger, there would be loud protestations, and maybe even, some fist waving. But you know what? The United States would, still continue as an institution after that. Cuba doesn't have the same power. So he points out that, rendition is always going to be a tool which is used by powerful countries against weak countries. Now, another thing that they pointed out, which I thought was very, very interesting, was this little blurb that they had in the headlines for today, talking about how the stuff from the bailout was hugely undervalued. And in other words, we paid way more for a lot of the bailout assets that we got than they were actually worth. Here, probe, government bailout exceeded market value of firm stocks assets. A congressional investigation has found the Bush administration overpaid tens of billions of dollars in its purchase of bank stocks and assets under the Wall Street bailout. The Congressional Oversight Panel says the government received assets with a market value worth at least $78 billion less than what it invested. That translates to a roughly 30-cent loss for every dollar the government spent. I shall add, of your money. So Bush was spending your money stupidly, paying way more than he should have for crap. another aspect of the bailout to get upset about. But the last thing that I was really intrigued by, and I'm going to post a link to this one because I think everybody should watch this interview because it's about the future. It really is. Well, in a way, all those things are, but this one more so than any of the other things that I saw. She had this guy on. His name is P.W. Singer. He works for the Brookings Institute. He was an advisor to Obama's campaign. All right, let's get that all out of the way. That being said, he was a really thoughtful guy and was asking some really interesting questions. He just written a book called Wired for War, talking about the robotics revolution and in the military, and talking about how these things are being used, the consequences for people, what it's like to both, make them, to operate them, to be on the receiving end of them. And it was just really, really fascinating and deeply disturbing as well, because I view this as the new kind of, it's another way of getting moral distance from war so that we can engage in it endlessly. I mean, the first wave of that was substituting mercenaries for people in our military. So this is a way, I think most importantly, to keep these people off the moral balance sheet of the war, because that's the way wars go bad, for people who want them. Eventually the human cost is what becomes unbearable for the population. They rise up, they demand an end to it, and then, the good times are over for the military-industrial complex. But if we can keep, mercenaries are the first stage, because now, okay, it's not our men in uniform, it's just like hired thugs, and nobody cares whether they die or not, even though they have families, etc. And like just the next stage of that is these unmanned drones, and now, at the beginning of the Iraq War, there was virtually nothing. There were a few drones in the air, and there weren't any drones on the land at all. Now there are just tons of them operating in Iraq, operating in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and he points out, that they're increasingly being used for applications here. They have, ones that aren't armed yet that are patrolling our border with Mexico, ostensibly to prevent drug trafficking, but there are probably immigration ramifications to their use as well. And even talking about how the city of Los Angeles was thinking of buying a drone and just putting it over a bad neighborhood and just having it film everything all the time. There you go. It's your permanent surveillance state. Now they don't even need to have a person up there doing it. They can just set it on autopilot and have it circle around and watch you all the time if you're unlucky enough to live in a bad neighborhood. But in terms of the wars, though, I think this is dangerous because you need to have people involved in the conflict, because if you have no moral cost, there's no moral hazard. If it's only a financial hazard, then we don't have an appropriate hedge against war. I mean, people are going to be outraged about, machines getting blown up, especially since we get increasingly good at hiding it. So those are my dreary assessments based on what I was watching this morning. I really recommend everybody watch the interview and not think that I've kind of put across the whole content of it, because a lot of things are explored in there. And I think it's well worth thinking about these things, as he points out, before they get totally out of control, like with the nuclear genie. Lots of ramifications, lots of things we need to think about in terms of the use of and building of this kind of technology. That's all for now. This is Zach Elliott, and you can certainly feel free to argue.